This lesson is about a woman from Moab named Ruth who lived during the time of the Judges, and it's one of two Old Testament books named after a woman, the other one being Esther. But though nobody knows who actually wrote down the account, nobody doubts that Ruth is the subject. Her life exemplifies the highest standards of character, devotion, hard work, honesty, sacrifice, and it shows that while Israel as a whole had largely sunk into idolatry and chaos, there were always some people who remembered God and the laws of Moses. And though God never speaks to her or anyone else in this account directly, his hand is clearly evident. So we can see this as we'll go along. Ruth's mother-in-law was Naomi, and she was an Israelite who had to move from Bethlehem to Moab with her husband and their two sons during a famine. After her husband died there, her sons married women from Moab, and one of those was Ruth. But when both of the sons also died, Naomi was left without support or land title or anything, so she decided to go back to Israel since the famine had ended, where at least she would have some rights as a widow, so she had better prospects there. And then we go down to verse 7, and on the way or right after they started, it's not exactly clear, the daughters-in-law who had come with her, Naomi stopped and thought, you know what, you should go home, you should go back to your people, your mothers, and you would have better prospects of finding families of your own, husbands and families. But Ruth wouldn't leave Naomi. She just flat out refused, and in verse 16 we see her usually is famous statement about loyalty and dedication to not only Naomi, but to her God and her people. And as far as she was concerned, she was abandoning Moab and adopting this new life in Israel. And Bethlehem, this is, of course, a famous town, and it was always a small village. Even then, it would continue to be. And in verse 20, in a small town, people know you. And so when Naomi came back, they remembered her and they were happy to see her. But she told them of all the tragedy that had befallen her, and she took it as punishment from God, although there's no mention of anything she had done that would make her deserve it more than other people. Nonetheless, she didn't blame him for wrongdoing, so it's just like with Job in the opening chapters, where inexplicably bad things happened to Job, and he never blamed God for it, although his friends, so-called, later on would come and insist that he deserved what he was getting. So the end of chapter 1 there states that the time of the year was the barley harvest, which would have been early spring. The first fruits would come from that. And of course, first fruits, as I think we've discussed in earlier lessons, means that there is a major harvest to come later. So this has obvious significance in Bible prophecy and the foreshadowing of the festivals to the eventual coming of the Messiah. So, and not just the coming, but also his crucifixion and resurrection. And then chapter 2, and there are only 4 chapters in this book, it opens with a note about the legal principle in Israel called the kinsman redeemer, who would be responsible for carrying on the line of any childless male relatives and also for supporting anyone in the clan who was impoverished. In this case, it was the kinsman redeemer was a wealthy and respected man named Boaz. Now, it doesn't appear that Naomi knew that at first when Ruth volunteered to go glean in the fields so they wouldn't starve. But God saw to it that she went to a field owned by Boaz, and the phrase just happened is God working things out behind the scenes, as we mentioned. So, and then in verse 4, on top of that, it just so happened that Boaz comes to greet the harvesters when Ruth is working there behind them. And he's told her story, how she got there and so forth. And though she's a foreigner, he treats her very kindly. So he was a decent guy, quite unlike the Levite in the story of that horrific thing in Judges. And then 2:18 is when she returns home, Ruth does, and shows Naomi this amazing haul of grain for the day. And Naomi then tells her that Boaz is their legal guardian, so she should continue working there because she'll be safe and he'll protect her. Because it's not only is he a nice guy, but he's also obligated by Jewish law. So that was a section there. And then down in chapter 3, eventually Naomi knows, or did know before, it doesn't really say, it indicates from the text that she, sometime in this intervening time, realized that as the kinsman redeemer, this was a good prospect for Ruth, who needed her own home and family. So Boaz would be required by law to marry her, but her solution is unorthodox, to say the least. She tells Ruth to do something very strange: dress up, wait till dark, sneak up on him while he's asleep, lie down beside him or at his feet, depending on how you interpret the language there, cover herself with his cloak, and then ask him to marry her. What is up with that? I think we're all making a face like this right now at Naomi's plan and solution to solving the problem of not only taking care of Ruth, but herself as well, obviously. So let's go down to verse 6. And I found some good points in the article linked in the description concerning Ruth and Boaz. First of all, there's no other examples in Scripture of this plan being a normal or customary way to propose marriage. Second, it leaves little to the imagination. Wait for a man to fall asleep after he's had plenty of food and drink, and then lie down beside him in your best outfit. Though there's no expressed or implied basis for claiming anything actually did happen, the intent was unmistakable. Third, compared to Samson, Ruth's actions are exemplary. And besides, she's only carrying out Naomi's instructions, and really the language there is more like an order. So she's not bringing customs from Moab or anything like that. This is all Naomi's idea. Fourth, the timing was meant to take advantage of Boaz being in a vulnerable state after celebrating the harvest, as only Naomi would know. Fifth, the reason Boaz didn't want anyone to know she'd been at the threshing floor likely had to do with the fact that people would presume immoral behavior had taken place. It may be that Naomi thought something would happen, and then Boaz would have no choice but to marry Ruth, since there seems to be no other explanation for this plan. And though that page tries to fault Naomi on the grounds that she should have let Boaz take the leadership role, overall the other points seem valid. Ruth can be excused for not knowing the legal issues and the social customs, but Naomi's fault, in my opinion, was not in taking initiative and the leadership role. That's not a fault of hers or a problem here, but rather the way she carried it out. After all, remember Tamar. She was considered the righteous one when she took the initiative to preserve the family line, and her methods were decidedly less defensible than Naomi's. So let's keep things in perspective here and not unduly blame Naomi, although she certainly had some faults here. Taking a leadership role was not one of them. As for the quote-unquote proposal itself that we can see down here in verse 9, the commentary that I referenced in the description makes a good case for translating it as the Greek does: take me under your wing, as next of kin. This idea of spreading a wing or corner or extremity, that's the meaning of the words, like wing of the temple and so forth. A corner of cloth over someone is common throughout Scripture. And she was more asking for security than expressing lust, which is proved by Boaz's response. She came to him instead of chasing younger men, because she was honorable and devout, and he knew this, and that's how he took this, regardless of what Naomi may have had in mind. So Ruth was just being selfless to a fault here, even if it meant risking her own reputation. But fortunately, Boaz was not the type to jump to conclusions like a lot of Christian men are when they read this. But if we go down here to chapter 4, the next day Boaz goes to the city gate to conduct the formal business of offering both the land and Ruth to the nearest kinsman, because there was one nearer than he was. But this kinsman exercises his option to pass the rights on to Boaz. But again, we see that, of course, that women were considered part of the property to be bought and sold, though also, again, they fared better in Israel than in many other societies at the time. And then down in verse 13, we see that they get married and have a son named Obed, who would turn out to be the father of Jesse, who would be the father of David. So the line of the future King David already includes a prostitute, Rahab, and a Moabite. God is not a respecter of persons, and as we'll see when we study the choosing of David as king, Neither does God choose servants on the basis of the flesh. But again, don't jump to wild conclusions that this means God is finished with the people of Israel as a nation, because that's fleshly. There are both elements in God's plans, but not when God decides to choose somebody. So that's pretty much it. And this story of Ruth is rich with symbolic meaning, short as it is. The one who was in grief and poverty is redeemed and sheltered due to the mercy of the one in a position to help. This Levirate law, they call it, kinsman redeemer, not having to do with the tribe of Levi. It's just the word for that kind of a law of a kinsman redeemer. They call Levirate. This Levirate law pointed to what Jesus would accomplish by stooping down and sacrificing for the world. And you can read about that in Philippians 2:5-11. Ruth also modeled Jesus in her selflessness and humility, also in that passage, while Boaz modeled Jesus in his redemption of the helpless and vulnerable. So both of them were modeling Jesus. In Scripture, God is never the one condoning the mistreatment of the poor or lowly. In fact, his laws put limits on abuse by the rich and powerful. The great error of modern Christianity is failure to recognize this characteristic of God in spite of New Testament scriptures such as James 4:6, which says that God is opposed to the proud but gracious to the humble, and 1 Corinthians 1:27, which says that God chose the foolish to shame the wise and the weak to disgrace the strong. Cold-hearted hierarchy is why the church has been far less effective than it is meant to be, and there's a link to my book on that topic in the description. So that's it for Ruth. Read through it yourself. Like I said, it's only 4 chapters, and we'll continue on with Samuel next time.